And here we are. Hello, everyone. We are live once again. I am Laura May Lindo, your MPP for Kitchener Centre, and also the critic for colleges and universities. I kind of forgot to tell people that when I was doing this in the last couple sessions. I just jumped right in and got excited. Today, we are again, as promised, carrying on our conversation about Laurentian, what is happening at Laurentian, the impact in Sudbury, in Northern Ontario, and across the sector, because there is, in fact, a ripple effect. When the government questions the importance of investing in any institution, none of us are actually safe. And so I thought it was really important to bring together some new friends and old friends from the sector right here in Waterloo Region to speak about what is happening at Laurentian. So as folks will know, if they have been following along in these fancy live streams, we had started our conversation with faculty associations on Monday, and that was primarily because the first big set of news was a huge number of faculty, tenured faculty positions that were lost, which a lot of people that look at the post-secondary sector think is an impossibility. And for many of us, we thought was an impossibility. And can tell you from my mommy out in Scarborough, she thought it was an impossibility. She thought that that would be a better job for me. And then she called me when the news hit in the Toronto Star and was like, Laura May, there are some issues and you've got some advocacy to do. So we started with the faculty associations. We moved on. We talked to staff, some faculty in various departments and programs. We've talked to students, to grad students, to TAs. We've talked to folks that are in yesterday's group was sort of some of the more precarious programming, social justice, music, the arts, that kind of programming. And this time, I have brought together some folks to talk specifically about the connection between the organizing that happens on a campus and what happens outside. And the reason I wanted us to talk about this, especially at Laurentian, is that many people will have read at this point the kinds of programs that are being lost at Laurentian because, again, the minister has not provided the funding that's needed to keep them afloat. We're looking at the loss of the midwifery program, the loss of the Indigenous Studies program, the loss of Francophone programs, all of which were serving Northern communities. The effect and ripple effect of that in Sudbury is actually being felt all across the province now. And so who do I have with me? I have Kathy Hogarth, who is the Special Advisor, Anti-Racism and Inclusivity to the Office of the Vice President, Research and International, as well as an Associate Professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Waterloo. And Kathy is also the co-founder of the Black Faculty Collective. I love that name. Just going to pause and reflect on that. Such a good name. Anyway, the co-founder of the Black Faculty Collective and the Anti-Racism Advisor to the Faculty Association at the University of Waterloo. I also have Alicia Lewinsky, who is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Global Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. I have Alex Latta, who is an associate professor of global studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, and Bina Mehta, who has been a contract teaching faculty member since 1993 at Trent, at Queen's, and at Wilfrid Laurier Universities. She currently is teaching in the Faculty of Arts at Laurier in Global Studies and North American Studies. And also, I wanted to make sure I said this out loud, Bina. During Laurier's transition to online learning this past year, Bina has also been a faculty peer mentor, exploring creative approaches for blended and remote teaching. Part of why I wanted to start, I'm going to give you sort of like a backdrop upon which our conversation is happening, but I wanted to make sure that I provided a little bit more about what Bina has been doing, because contract academic staff members have become the backbone of the post-secondary sector, which is quite interesting because of the precarity of their work. So I want to throw a little bit of gratitude and love your way, because for the contract staff, I don't feel like they often get that. And we still don't have a very good sense of how many contract staff may have lost employment at Laurentian in the midst of all of this change and transition. I know that it started with us discussing about full-time faculty and tenured faculty, and the loss of their research funds and potential research projects, etc. We've had some discussion about grad students that are part of research teams, etc., that could be impacted, but I have not heard any kind of stats about what's happening with contract staff. I'm feeling like there's oh, no, wait, I'm back. So for those out there, I'm also going to put a plug in for better investment in broadband internet services because my internet keeps freezing. So if I disappear, I promise I'll come back and I will write a letter to all of the ministers asking for better broadband investments as well as two-way all-day go, in case you're wondering the kinds of things that I'm fighting for Kitchener Centre and beyond. Okay, now, here's the deal. I started having these public conversations because as the critic, I was receiving a lot of emails from people, phone calls and requests to be at meetings that were asking specifically for investment from the government into Laurentian. There was a clear understanding that the government should step in. It was their responsibility to step in and save Laurentian. And then I started to receive calls from unions. We were seeing calls from various unions as well as letters that were coming to my office. They were saying to me that they wanted the minister to resign. I am of the opinion that if we are not very clear about what it is that we want to see in our minister and what it is that investment in the sector should look like, we will end up just with somebody else in that role doing exactly the same thing. The behavior will not change. We will not have what it is that we need. And so I wanted to bring people together to speak about this with a clear understanding that there are so many different pieces of what our post-secondary sector does, what a university does. And so today we will end up talking a little bit more about the reciprocity between university and college spaces and campuses and the communities in which they live and exist within. But I want us to start with a very simple yet not so simple question, a kind of heartbreaking question. What are you folks hearing on the ground within your particular circles about the impact of this lack of investment from the government to save Laurentian? I'm going to start with, I do this all random, my friends. I'm going to start with, they don't even know, it could be anyone. Alex, you're the lucky winner. You get to start. Talk to me. Tell me what you're hearing about the concerns that folks have with Laurentian, what it is that they wish that they could see, what kinds of worries might be running through the sector within your spheres.
Yeah, thanks, Laura May, for bringing us together on this really important topic. I mean, I think everyone is still in shock. I would say I think many of us see Laurentian as kind of like an example is being made of Laurentian in a sense, in the context of a disciplinary approach to the higher education sector, where increased government surveillance of what we do in terms of performance measures and tying funding to all sorts of metrics that we need to measure about what we're doing, and that's all part of it's all part of an approach to education that makes us operate as if we're private sector institutions, and we're not. So that's another, what's happened at Laurentian has, it's violated collective agreements. It's violated the collegial governance of the institution. All of the things that really make our universities a particular kind of public institution. And so it's threatening our very way of being as institutions. And I think we've been under pressure for a long time. I mean, since I arrived at Laurier 2006, cuts have been sort of par for the course every couple of years. Oh, we're going to have some more cuts. And so it's this ongoing squeeze, and the squeeze gets tighter and tighter. And Laurentian is, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't buckle down and do more with less, continue to do more with less. So that's what I've been feeling and hearing from others too.
Thank you for that, Alex. It's interesting that you say that justification piece, because that's also another thread that I've been hearing even before I had the critic portfolio, because I'm fairly new to this particular critic portfolio. I received it in February. It got switched, but I was hearing that there was the notion of these performance measures. There was so much anger and rage and sort of pushback and resistance to moving in that direction, because in the sector we know what that could translate into. And now Laurentian seemed to be this perfect opportunity to justify other kinds of measures that it seems like the government already had in mind for the sector. And so I'm starting to hear that more and more and more as people are putting the pieces together, and certain announcements are starting to come out, right? I'm going to throw it over. Thank you again, Alex. I'm going to throw it over to you, Kathy. Talk to me about what it is that you're hearing, what kinds of concerns folks are having, issues that they're worried about now that they're seeing what's happening at Laurentian. Oh, and you've got to just unmute. You are still muted.
I think for me, there are two big things.
Yeah.
One is we humanizing. And so at the end of the Laurentian debate are humans, students who've spent tons of money in education and now have lost years, but they've lost, for many of them, what seems to be a future, even in the midst of an already precarious reality. In the midst of a pandemic, they've lost another thread of hope to a future. We've got faculty members who, when we talk, for years we've been talking about post-secondary educational institutions as the biggest temp agency.
Yep.
We've been talking about the precarious nature and how we see this encroachment of the temporary workforce and the challenges with that. And then there were those of us who we had security, tenured positions, security in the midst of precarity. And suddenly all of that has vanished. Suddenly it brings into question not just for Laurentian, but for all of us. Well, are the things I held to as a safety net, are they really that secure when governments, systems can just walk away, can just leave you? At the end of it all, we've got human beings, we've got lives at stake.
Yeah.
The other big thing for me is what Laurentian represented, Northern Ontario, a bridge. And to lose that bridge, Indigenous, the significant loss to access for Indigenous people, access to education, to post-secondary education, that's a significant loss that I think we need to take responsibility for as a society. We've had a number of discussions publicly about responsibility and whose responsibility, and we can get all tied up in financial mismanagement and all of those things. But at the end of the day, what's at stake? When I hear the pain of my colleagues who have suddenly their lives, it was unexpected. It's horrendous. It's a gut feeling, and it really makes us all question our stability.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kathy. It's I happened to be invited to be on a call the same day that the cuts to all of these programs and the job losses happened, and it was a very quickly organized phone call, and there were like over 100 people on there, and the reality of losing not just your job but the potential loss in community, right? Like they were immediately aware of what this could mean in Sudbury. They were acutely aware of what that could mean for their access, their social mobility, what they could bring back to community, especially for Indigenous students who had gone into this program to do not just their own learning, but to be able to bring what they have learned back to community to better the community. And what we were hearing from the government simultaneously was, oh, we'll just move them somewhere else, as though that notion alone is not triggering yet again, right? But the other thread that, not but, and the other thread that I wanted to pick up on from what you were saying, Kathy, and that humanizing piece, yesterday's discussion, I had Laurie Campbell with us, who is phenomenal. And one of the things that she said that has sort of stuck out to me, we've spoken a lot about the loss of the Indigenous Studies program. And she was reminding all of us that that program, as longstanding as it was, also had an impact on the other courses that were being taught at Laurentian, that there was a shift in the way that education was even being done on campus because of that longstanding Indigenous Studies program. And so that to me goes back to not just the humanizing of this and the impact, to take a look at that, but also our commitments to TRC, like our commitments to reconciliation. How can the government just turn around and say, we don't want to invest there, or make up any kind of excuse? It just, to me, it is unconscionable that we would think that this is okay. I'm going to throw it over to you now, Bina, just to talk a little bit about what it is that you're hearing in your circles, concerns that people are raising, etc.
Oh, Laura May, this is devastating that we're actually having to have this conversation. When I found out on February 4th, my union asked for letters of support for what was happening at Laurentian. And, some of the words that were being used were words like, this is a long-term problem. There's a lack of instability in terms of government funding. And it strikes me that these are huge systemic issues.
Yeah.
That these are problems that contract faculties, universities have been suffering chronic underfunding, not just in the last 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but in the last 20, 25 years. And so we've seen universities turn to other sources of funding to make universities go, or as Alex says, cuts. Every couple of years, there's this sort of annual, okay, what are we going to cut?
Yep.
And it also strikes me as this, that Northern Ontario is still a part of Ontario. And Northern Ontario gets lost. And yet we, it is really still considered the periphery. We are the core and they are the periphery. And these core periphery ideas about exchange of not just things that come from the ground and the earth, but of ideas. These things are going to be lost. And, Laurentian's crisis, it seems to me, is not their crisis. It is a crisis of Ontario.
Yeah.
And, I think that it's important for those folks in Sudbury, those folks who are in Northern Ontario, to know that some of us at the Southern universities care, that we're worried, not just for the sake of, oh, this might also happen to us,
No.
but what's happening to you is not right.
Yeah.
And so, I think that if we can support anything in giving agency or making space for those people who are going to be out of work, those communities who are losing those really rich programs, we should do before we think about, what's going on. But all of this is long term. It's not just precarious, but it's about the periphery, and it's about, the connection between Southern Ontario and Northern Ontario. There are a lot of really important things that need to be done and said. But the thing is that this is not shocking. This is not surprising that Northern Ontario would be the first to take, such a huge hit. I think that, as contract faculty, this is our day-to-day discourse. This is what is happening to us at Southern universities. Contract people are often felt like they're left out of the conversation. So, you holding this conversation, I think, is a really important step for recognizing that, it is through conversation that we can hopefully support one another, and especially those folks in the North right now. Indigenous programs especially are in my heart as we speak.
Thank you so much for that. It is heartbreaking to see what's happening, and it is hard to hold the reality that you could see it coming, because the chronic underfunding, right? That lack of investment in the sector, you could see it coming. You could see who and what programs would be dismantled first. For those in the sector, we often can take a pretty good guess about what that could look like. But what I'm finding really fascinating at this time in history is that on the economic side of the province, this government mounted a finance and economic recovery committee to talk about how we're going to navigate the pandemic and that economic driver and what does this mean and what supports do we need, etc. I inserted myself into that committee. We listened to over 600 hours of various sectors coming in for over 600 hours of hearings to talk about how to reignite our economy post-pandemic. And at the same time that they're doing that, they're doing this. They're dismantling literally an economic driver in Sudbury and in Northern Ontario. And they're doing so with, as you were saying, Bina, this idea that I don't think people want to articulate, but I know is there in the background, that everybody wants to be part of the core. Everybody isn't it better to get them out of Northern Ontario and down to Toronto or down to the city center, which is a discourse and a challenge, I think, that people have been trying to resist, but we haven't necessarily articulated as well. And because we're not entirely certain what the master plan is in behind this, it is one of the concerns that I have. And for me, when I think about the attack on the Francophone community and the Francophone programs, I keep wondering if this is a master plan to get folks from a thriving program at Laurentian, or a program with more investments would be even bigger and be able to provide a particular kind of support in Northern Ontario for the Francophone community there, and move them into this new university that the government now wants to take credit for building, even though they denied the funding to that university early on in their tenure too. J'ai beaucoup de choses à dire. Alors maintenant, c'est pour toi, Alicia. If you want to talk to us a little bit about what you're hearing on the ground, en anglais ou en français, ça va, and what kinds of concerns people have as we navigate the lack of investment that we're seeing at Laurentian.
All right, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Laura May. Je vais juste parler 2 minutes en français pour la communauté franco-ontarienne. Je ne suis pas de l'Ontario. Vous entendez que j'ai l'accent français. Je viens de Montréal, mais je veux parler de ce que j'entends de mes amis qui parlent français de la communauté francophone que je connais ici au Québec. And I will continue in English for everybody, but I just wanted to say that my comments are going to focus a little bit on this. I've been reading that 28 programs at least have been cut in the French language, including like political science in French, the theater program in French, which has huge effects on the arts, on, for example, the Le Théâtre du Nouvel Ontario. Mm-hmm. An image that somebody told me is it felt like one of those big uprooting equipments that just uproots trees, clack, 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 and gone. And so a lot of shock, anger, violence, sadness, disbelief, and for me and for some of my friends here in Kitchener-Waterloo, there's the realization that we need to get maybe a little bit more involved than we were in the past in terms of the governance of our universities, the good governance of our universities. You mentioned something, Laura May, at the beginning. You talked about reciprocity. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that really has to be disseminated and understood clearly, that there is tremendous benefits of universities in their communities that they serve, especially for communities in non-large urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, etc. They are creators of prosperity, creators of economic growth, fine, but of flourishing of human beings, like Kathy said, of tons of sorts of innovations and resilience at a time when we have, climate change and a pandemic. Universities are these spaces for social interaction between all kinds of stakeholders, if we want to use this language, to they'll get to know each other, to create better environments, to change policies. There's it's a ton of creativity. It's a fantastic space. It's a space also to create citizens and flourishing humans in all kinds of sectors. So when you were saying that, economically, you cut a university, you're cutting the whole creation of a middle class, of investment. I mean, it is une aberration, a lot of aberration. So that's one piece I wanted to say. I find that there's a lot of disrespect in this move as well. The suddenness for Indigenous communities, Franco-Ontarian communities, international students, Francophone international students from Senegal, from Côte d'Ivoire. I've been reading articles in French lately about this. So they arrive, they pay big bucks compared to Canadians. And they're left like this. How am I going to finish my program? It has ripple effects in terms of reputation, I find, and they find as well too. So cutting a university or programs like this has huge impacts on vitality of communities beyond Laurentian, beyond Ontario, in the Francophone world in Canada. In France, I've seen things in France about this, and in the wider Francophonie world. So universities do have the teaching and the research, but they have a ton of outreach in their communities and elsewhere. So we have to think about this too with this tragedy.
Thank you so much for that. Merci beaucoup. It's interesting that you ended on that note about the community outreach that's happening, because that's part of what I want us to dig into as I ask the next question, which is my visualizing or speaking it into being with MPP Lindo. It's how I feel when I say it, but it's really it's what I think we need to be doing, right? I remember that when I was at Laurier, for instance, and I was overseeing the gendered violence prevention portfolio, in order for us to provide support to survivors, we had to reach into community and find out where were the supports that were available for the students, like for survivors, because we didn't have that level of expertise on campus. We had to figure out how we were going to build that level of expertise, and we had to take the advice and the leadership of programs in the Faculty of Social Work for us, and leaders like Jeanette Lafreniere that was there, that had given all of these reports about what was happening, which groups were not being provided with culturally responsive supports for survivors. And we had to start to do some of that mobilizing and advocacy to build a stronger, better, more inclusive community. That wasn't about Laurier. That was about building in Waterloo Region. But the reason I raise this is that at that point, it was under the Liberal government. We weren't getting funding to do that. And so the administration had to make decisions about how they were going to do things to provide the investment that they knew that we needed. So as my mummy says, I tell you that to tell you this. As we're thinking through what it is that we want in a minister, because as I said earlier, removing this minister and replacing him with somebody who just does the exact same thing is not going to solve any of our problems, not in Northern Ontario, not at Laurentian, not at any institution. But articulating with clarity what it is that we want them to understand about the sector, what investment looks like for us because of that kind of reciprocity between community and university or post-secondary institution, and what students, faculty, and staff need in order to thrive and become the people that we want them to be, the kinds of citizens that do care and hold people with love and compassion. We need the minister and a government that understands that. So I'm going to throw it back over to you folks to talk to me about what it is that you want to see in a minister that would provide that reciprocity, that would allow them to understand the importance of what happens both on campus and off campus, and why that is so important for them to invest in this sector. I am going to start with Bina.
Well, I think we really need to, first of all, increase awareness about this amongst the people within our own communities here in the South. And I think that so far, there has not been enough noise. There has not been enough noise or rabble-rousing, Laura May, about this.
I like that word.
I know, that needs to be done on this. And at the very core of community is, to me, this idea of the connection with each other. And if you look at this example of Laurentian, this is the way we are treating minority communities. International students, as Professor Slewinski is talking about, racialized faculty who are being pushed out, Indigenous folks, Franco-Ontarians who are very important to the story of Canada and of Ontario, of rural people. So these are the blocks that make up this community, who are in such a terribly, unstable place with the shutting down of this university. And the word precarious is one, I think, that the minister needs to understand in its humanity. He needs to, we need to be really, really clear about the different aspects of the rural, northern, racialized, international, Franco-Ontarian communities that are being impacted by this, that are, and when I think about, I love teaching. I love the university sector. I don't stay in it for the money, believe me, but I stay in it because I have community, because I have folks that are, around me that really care about knowledge and care about things that are, going to move us forward as a society. And so, I would say that it would be really important to make folks who are in positions of power to understand that this precarious nature of what is happening at Laurentian involves lots of different voices. And those voices need to come together to really articulate how we can, be in support of people in Northern Ontario and Sudbury and Laurentian, but also, to recognize that there are voices there that are really in bad places. That we can create communities that are supportive of one another. And this dialogue, this conversation, this is all part of it. This is what we need to have happen. So that's where I think we need to gather those voices. We need to collect. We need to, come together, even if it's on frickin' Zoom. We need to do it. I didn't swear.
No, you didn't. You didn't. Thank you. Thank you, Bina. That is fantastic. And what I am hearing from that is something that I'm often saying about centering the most vulnerable. But centering the most vulnerable, I think sometimes people hear it as there's like a one-size-fits-all description of who is vulnerable. But for me, it's different. Like what is needed in Northern Ontario is different than what is needed in Toronto. I need the minister to understand that. I need the minister to recognize that by cutting the midwifery program, there's nobody training midwives in Northern Ontario, because that's what that program did. And so it's not about a one size fits all solution, and cost savings, etc. It's about literally investing in people and making sure that the most vulnerable there, or gaps in society are being addressed. People that are typically not the center of these investments are now the center of these investments. And if the minister is not thinking about that, then there's no way that the coffers of the province, which is our taxpayer dollars, are going to go to the people and the places and the things that we know need additional help and support. Alex, I'm going to throw it over to you. What is it that you want to see in the minister? What kinds of investments in post-secondary do you want to see? We're talking it into being.
Well, I want to pick up on really Bina's, I think, enthusiasm for the university sector. I think that you know, when you look at the programs that are getting cut at Laurentian, I think a lot of people in just throughout Ontario society probably didn't even know that those kinds of programs, you know, even existed. And they existed because they were created by really imaginative, hardworking faculty members, staff members at the university who, you know, saw the need to address our social problems, address our social inequalities, address, you know, racism and discrimination, and to build programs that would help us as a society, in this case, in the Laurentian context, to tackle these things. And this is what education should be about, really. And I think Alicia also spoke to this too, the idea of building citizens, right? And so I think what we need is a Minister of Education that understands that broad value of education. And you know, we've seen the government increasingly moving towards the idea that we're just a kind of a factory for workers. We want to pump out people who have a bunch of quantifiable skills that are supposedly going to make them competitive in the workplace. And you know, as faculty members, I think we actually are really in favor of education that is, you know, applicable, that can help people actually do things in the world. But that narrow economistic vision of what education should be doing is the wrong vision. And I mean, you know, going back to where I started, I mean, universities are amazing places. They're full of talented and really committed people. And if this government just funded the university sector, even at something closer to the average, the Canadian average per student, you know, universities like Laurentian wouldn't be going under. And the Canadian average is not a good average when you compare it to other, you know, other nations kind of that Canada likes to compare itself to, you know, where education is free or almost free and stuff like that. You know, we have put so much pressure across Canada, but Ontario is at the bottom of the heap in terms of performance. So much pressure on our universities to do more with less. University recruitment is a blood sport in Ontario. I mean, it's no wonder that Laurentian struggles to get students, because, oh my gosh, you go to the university fair, we have to, as faculty members, we have to go and like be marketers for our universities. And it's really horrific, actually, that it's come to this where we are in competition with each other. And, you know, there's probably lots of people out there at universities, other universities, saying, wow, not that, thankfully that's not us, because we've got our game in, you know, we've got our anyways. I just, it drives me crazy that we do not have funding for the things that matter, and education matters.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. I have to say that sometimes I think that folks don't understand where our research ideas come from, right? Like when we're sitting and we're teaching our classes and whatever, a lot of the times the courses that get developed and the research projects that we try and create and the people, the community that we try and bring together to do that research, it's literally to address gaps in systems. It's literally for us to be able to better understand problems so that we can fight for investments that make change and support folks outside. And sometimes I wonder if that's been the the strategy for the government to keep that piece of what we do on a university campus secret and hidden from the broader public, so that the broader public doesn't fight for the investments in that same space, right? And then you can keep that myth of all of us in these ivory towers talking about things but not actually doing any problem solving. So I think it's so important for us to talk about that. And I go back to that notion of the reciprocity, the importance of that investment. But if you do not have a minister that understands what universities do, or is not willing to re-envision it, because with this pandemic and with what we are seeing, we have an opportunity to reimagine the university sector and rebuild it in a way that actually does allow us to thrive, then it's never going to happen. So on that happy note, I'm handing it over to Kathy. Kathy, what do you want to see from a minister of colleges and universities, and what does investment in this sector look like for the kind of work we want to do?
I sat here thinking, if I were hiring a minister, here are some of the questions I would ask him.
Rabble rousing. Bring it.
Do you understand the symbiotic relationship between university, community, and the globe? We cannot see universities merely as ivory towers where great thinking takes place that has no relevance to wider society. In fact, we must see universities as an extension of community, and we must see universities as places on which community and the globe really becomes or is dependent on.
Mm-hmm.
When I've done a lot of work in international sector, and so when I think of the international student is coming to Laurentian, but what that international student is doing is coming to Canada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Laurentian, for that student, for that family, for that community abroad, Laurentian is Canada.
Yep.
Therefore, we cannot take a very myopic view of university. Universities are vibrant organisms on which community thrives. So let's go back to midwifery, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
and what that represents for a northern community, where hospitals access to healthcare for women in labor may be precarious. What does midwifery do?
Mm-hmm.
We really, universities, and I'm not saying that because I sit in an ivory tower. I'm saying that the work that I do in a university setting is about changing my world. The work that I engage in is about building my community. It's about building Canada. It's about building a better world for us. So, dear minister, whoever you will be, do you understand the significance of universities, not just to the place in which it's situated, but in circles around it and circles around our globe? Dear Minister, do you understand those links? Dear Minister, if education is seen as something that's transformative, is seen as something that's generative to our world, how do we not fund? How do we walk away?
Yeah.
How do we walk away.
Mm-hmm.
That's my impassioned plea.
It's fantastic. Thank you very much, Kathy, for that. One of the pieces of that resonated with me, I wrote it down because when you were talking about building the community, the work that you're doing is about making a better world. That kind of idea of what the purpose is of us investing our time and our energy in being in these spaces. I wanted to add that it's also about rebuilding a world that doesn't leave this many people behind, right? Like we can't leave the Francophone community behind as we rebuild in post-secondary. We can't leave Indigenous students behind or Black students behind or racialized students behind or queer students. We can't leave people with disabilities behind. We can't leave the poor behind. And as much as people will say, oh, but that Laura May, that's too big, right? There's so many people. There's so many things. It's a slippery slope. If we start to help one person, then everything's going to go downhill. I'm of the opinion that no. Once we start to help people, we've empowered them. They become part of the crew that's helping other people. Like, what are we talking about? Who do we want to be in this world? And so I don't want to leave anybody behind. And I don't want a minister that thinks that Northern Ontario is expendable as he's trying to balance his budgets. Makes me angry. I'm angry. Alicia, over to you. What do you want to see in a minister? What do you want to see as an investment in post-secondary? What kinds of things can we speak into being so that we do rebuild a post-secondary sector in a way that actually supports and cares for all of us?
Yes, I want to thank all my colleagues and you as well, Laura May, for this inspiring and passionate conversation. What do I want in a minister? I want a minister who knows more about the sector. Maybe he should come and sit in a seminar for 1 year in liberal arts on the different faculties and see all the wonderful activity that goes on and the potential to create prosperity, more just, resilient, green world in many ways. So I think there's a disconnect maybe in between the people who make decisions and the people who are the frontline workers of education, the students, the contract faculty who are in a huge precarious situation. I'd like a big budgetary envelope to provide contract faculty permanent positions. These are esteemed colleagues that we've been working with over a decade or two. I'd like that to change. I'd like society to understand that universities are the cauldron where you imagine the future. So this is where you imagine des projets de société, projects of society. And they are very special spaces of debate as well, spaces of disagreement, spaces of analyzing truth claims. This is precious. It's sacred. And I want to echo Alex and Bina who say, we really love our jobs. I absolutely adore my job. It is under threat. It's the first time I participate in a space like this. It's because it is very important to preserve the space, to enhance it, to nurture it. And I would say
to open.
Okay. To the minister to show a bit more respect, not to make quick decisions, and to my fellow citizens that education sector can change. Students don't have to accumulate so much debt. There's other choices. Look at Germany, for example. So when I say a projet de société, a project of society, it is also about the nickel and dimes of the investment, and in terms of how do we want to live together in diversity on this globe, So it's quite lofty what I'm saying, but there's very concrete measures, The performance metrics is like the structural adjustment programs in the 80s and the 90s. They were applied to the foreign debt of different countries. The same thing. It didn't work. I don't think these performance metrics are going to work for the sector, for the students, for the parents, I just don't trust it. Anyway, so sorry for rambling a little bit, but those are some of my thoughts.
No, that was fantastic. I'm sorry that I just yelled at one of my children while I thought I was on mute, but clearly I was not. So, hey, everyone, I was just trying to get somebody to open up the door. Nobody did, in case you're wondering what's happening over here. I love this idea of the projet de société, right? Like this idea that it's all about building and rebuilding and can you hear him? Because he's knocking on, my son is is knocking on the door and trying to get my attention, even though he knows that I'm talking to all of you. So this is what's going to happen. I'm going to wrap her up really quickly. Okay, honey. Yeah. And that honey was for all of you that are watching. So here's the thing. I love where this conversation has ended for this week as well, because what we've done is we've spoken very specifically about a horrid situation happening at Laurentian, in Sudbury, in Northern Ontario, and slowly grown this conversation to a place where we have spoken into being from a variety of different people that make up our post-secondary community, what we believe to be the core value of the post-secondary sector. And it's literally building a better world. Like, that's what I keep hearing throughout this entire week. That is what my research, the researcher inside of me is hearing from everybody. It's about finding gaps in our social fabric and finding ways to mend them that are creative and that center people and that are good for the planet and that ensure that some of the most vulnerable that typically don't have a space at this table do have a voice and a space at this table. And if that's what we are trying to do in this sector, then it is shameful that we would have a government or a minister who would not want to invest in that. Because not investing in that means not investing in Ontarians. And as far as I'm concerned, as an elected official, that's literally my job. My job is literally to fight for people. And that means fighting for these investments and making them real. So thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you to everybody who has been listening. Thank you for your rage, and thank you for your desire to turn that rage into action, to make change and to advocate. There will be more of these discussions, guaranteed. And for now, goodbye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.